vitarka, vichara, ananda, shmita, rupanugamat, sampragyataha. When concentration or samadhi is reached gradually with the help of deliberation on gross forms, then reflection on subtle objects, then a state of blissfulness, and finally awareness of one's true individuality, which is called sampragyata samadhi. So in this new sutra, number 17, there are a number of really important words that have been used here. So just take a little time to look at the words and their English synonyms. Here in this sutra, Patanjali lays out the 4 stages of the development of concentration that culminate in sampragyata samadhi, and that is vitarka, vichara, ananda, and ashmita. When we examine, the things that we're going to talk about here, and this is probably going to get a little bit detailed. The whole goal is, in this process of yoga being laid out by Patanjali, is a process of self-realization, coming to know who I actually am as a spiritual being, spiritual individual. It is really important to understand the nature of the body and the subtle body and the material world. We have for so long identified with this as being ourself, who we are, and being able to examine these things very carefully will help us to understand what we are not. This process of elimination. So this process is tied to the realization of the nature of Prakriti, the material energy. The material energy is composed of what has been described as 24 tattvas. These 24 truths or 24 realities are found in the Sankhya yoga teachings and also throughout the Vedas. And these 24 elements of material nature consist of the following. The first are the what's called the Pancha Mahabhuta, the 5 gross elements. That is earth, water, fire, air, and ether. So we're going to be talking about this in a little bit of detail, and be patient with yourself, because some of these ideas and things are going to be quite new. When we talk about a material element here, we have, for instance, with earth, water, fire, etc., we have some experience and we have some capacity to identify and to sort of like understand these things. But we should understand that as elements, they existed prior to their being manifest. For instance, the earth on this particular planet, before it even manifest, the element existed as part of Prakriti. And each one of these 5 elements are, there is a concomitant, what's called sense object, that is tied to each of them. So the 5 sense objects, known as the Pancha Tanmatra, are aroma, taste, form, touch, and sound. Now, when we speak about these things, we're speaking about something that's like, it's not very familiar to us, or those who have not been trained in Vedic spirituality or Indian or yogic philosophy, or any of the dharmic religions, or dharmic paths rather. The next set of items that we're going to talk about are what's known as the 10 sense organs. Of the 10 sense organs, there are 5 that are considered knowledge gathering senses and 5 working senses. So the Panch Gyanindriya, Jnana means knowledge and Indriya is the senses, Pancha meaning 5. So the 5 knowledge gathering senses, they are of course the nose, the tongue, the eyes, the skin, and the ears. Now, what is quite interesting is that there are a correlation between these 3 groups of 5 things that I mentioned previously. You have the 5 gross elements. Each of them is tied to one of the what's called Tan Matra. The Tan Matra, for instance, sound, or we'll go with the top of the list here, aroma. Aroma is, is smell, and that emanates from one of the 5 gross elements, earth. Earth is responsible for the generation of aroma. But aroma itself is considered a sense object. And that sense object plays a role in the development or manifestation of the sense organ of the nose. So we've got the earth, the aroma that's produced, and then the sense organ itself, the nose. And similarly with each one of these, if you look down this list, you will see that there is a correlation or a connection between these 3 groups of 5. Then the next 5 items are the 5 working senses, and this is called Pancha, Karma Indriya. Karma meaning action, and Indriya is senses of action. So they are constituted of the voice, the legs, the hands, the anus, and the genitals. Now, in addition to these 20 items that we've already mentioned, we add the mana, or the mind, the chitta, or the contaminator or material consciousness, the buddhi, the intelligence, and ahankara, the false ego. Thus we have a total of 24 elements in all. Now, traditionally, they were divided into 2 groups, 16 gross elements, of which the mind is included. And you might ask, well, why is the mind when it seems to be way more subtle? It is more subtle than those other elements in that part of the grouping, but it is also still considered one of the gross elements. And then you have 8 subtle elements. So the reference that's been made to gross and subtle is going to be somewhat connected to this, what I'm pointing out to you now. And of course, apart from these 24 tattvas, the living being, the individual jiva, was considered the 25th principle, and the Paramatma, or Ishvara, was considered the 26th principle. So, in the verse that we've read from earlier, if you take another look at that, when concentration or samadhi is reached gradually with the help of deliberation on gross forms, then reflection on subtle objects, then a state of blissfulness, and finally awareness of one's true individuality, this is called sampragyata samadhi. So, in relation to that verse, Vyasa, in his analysis of this, talks about 4 different types of samadhi. The samadhi here is not total transcendental absorption. It is more connected to concentration leading to transcendental absorption. And so the first was called Vitarka Samadhi, or Savitaka Samadhi, which was a deliberation on gross forms. So what are we talking about here? The yogis, in their exploration, or their endeavor to try and find what is the truth and the reality of things, they would explore things like sound. They would explore how my body and mind and senses react to different types of stimuli, how that affects my mind, how it leaves these deep imprints on the consciousness, and they would really explore how the Purusha, the living being, is being incredibly overwhelmed by these types of experiences. So there will be a number of these different explanations in sutras that are coming up in a couple of other padas, where they look at in some detail about the nature of the reflections. But I'll just give you one example to try and help things along. Sound. The yogis would really try to meditate upon and learn to distinguish the difference between the sound of syllables in a word, what that represents, and associated experience that is attached to that. For most of us, if we say cow, and if we've been anywhere near a cow or around a cow, then when we say cow, when we hear the word, everything becomes just one big jumble. Meaning, when we say cow, we think of a form, we think of something that we have seen, we may think of a smell that is associated with a cow, we may think of what it feels like to touch it or to be licked by its really rough tongue on your hand. There may be an enormous amount of different experiences that we've had in relation to the animal. And when we say the word cow, all of these things are sort of like all jumbled up together, and we just have one sort of like overall or overriding impression. And the yogis would seek to understand how we are living out this dream state of material existence, where the living being is trapped in this vehicle and utterly absorbed in the experience. And this vehicle is pretty much out of control. We've used the example before of the chariot, which was commonly used, where you've got the 5 horses pulling a chariot, the 5 horses being the different senses, the reins being the mind, the chariot driver being the buddhi, or the intelligence, and the chariot itself being like the body, and then the passenger in the chariot is the living being. And if the buddhi is not really firmly holding the reins, then the senses tend to be running wildly out of control, and the mind is just like going along with it. And for most people, their journey of their life is just this whole series of experiences and events that just take us on this emotional roller coaster and stimulate us to desire and to act in different ways, which all then binds us to this perpetual experience of birth and death. And so part of this meditative reflection was upon the nature of how we have been bound to the material world. And by meditating upon some of these grosser elements and the different types of sensual experience and everything, the consciousness that arises from the experience of these different things, the yogis sought to more clearly be able to identify themselves as being separate from these experiences. So after often meditating upon the gross forms, the gross material elements and things, the yogi would desire to look at things on an even finer level. But I'll give you one more example of meditating upon or being really focused on the nature of the material energy. There was the understanding that ultimately there is like a unit, a small unit, a building block of matter. I think what we could relate to within the field of science as we learn it in the Western world, if we look at 3 of the atomic particles, I know that there are some subatomic particles, but look at just protons, neutrons, and electrons. There is only fundamentally one kind of electron, one kind of proton, one kind of neutron. These same 3 elements, when they are arranged in a certain manner, they appear to us to be something that is desirable, like a lump of chocolate. We look at that chocolate and we go, wow, yeah, I'd really like to eat that, and I can smell an aroma that's coming from it. Those exact same protons, neutrons, and electrons can be rearranged into something that is incredibly undesirable. Excuse the grossness, dog shit. And if I put them side by side, from the point of view of atomic particles, there's no difference. The atomic particles have just formed into different types of molecular structures. They are perceived by my senses differently. There are different associations with them. And so for the yogis, it was really, just astonishing, like what's going on and how this dream state that we're living in and known as material life is manifesting and existing. If I take something like a glass of water in my hand, and if I had one here and it was half full of water, if we were to look at that, go down to it on a molecular or atomic level, it's actually not really possible to distinguish between where the air above the water stops and the water begins. On an atomic level, that would pretty much merge together. And then where the glass meets the water, there's no clear and really super distinct barrier on the atomic level. nor the glass sitting upon my hand. And yet we're seeing and experiencing things in this certain way that we've become accustomed to, and it utterly overwhelms us, and we become utterly lost to our own spiritual existence, the reality of who we are. They refer to the material world in the Srimad Bhagavatam as being the world of names. And that's a really profound idea. And what they mean by that is ultimately the material creation, it's all the same stuff. There is, when you break it down to its smallest components, it's all just the same stuff. But it's appearing and collecting together in different ways, and we give the collection of these same particles different names, and we relate to those names as being desirable or undesirable. And this is considered actually just a monumental illusion. So what happens when the yogis would go through these, real deep meditative consideration of the nature of the gross and subtle forms that constitute, or elements that constitute, the material world, they would be able to increasingly then understand, well, that's not me, and that's not me, then who am I? Because most of the time in my life I've come to accept all of these material elements as being me. So when a person becomes more absorbed in these meditative states and their practice, there is a condition of peacefulness that begins to come over them. And in that peacefulness, one experiences a newfound type of joy, of deep blissfulness that is called ananda. This is not yet the highest spiritual experience of blissfulness. This is just the beginning, where one is being relieved of all the burden of material consciousness and material experience and all the burden that comes with that. What happens is that the person is increasingly placing themselves or situating themselves more firmly in what's called the mode of goodness, the sattva guna. Rajaguna stimulates passion, the desire to create, to build, for activity and all of this kind of thing, but carries with it also tremendous distress. They're inescapable, these things. Sattva guna by nature brings a state of more peacefulness and a withdrawal from the kinetic or frantic activity of material life. And with that comes an experience of great happiness. And as one becomes more absorbed in that experience, it becomes deeper and deeper, and this is considered a form of samadhi, of blissful immersion. And then it leads to what's called ashmita. This is the awareness of one's true spiritual individuality. As one begins to experience that, as it begins to awaken, there is this overwhelming sense of utter relief from this great journey through many countless lifetimes of incredible suffering and difficulty. So this process was one of the key processes, this reflection or deliberation upon gross forms, and then a reflection upon the subtle material objects, the blissfulness that came from an immersion into a more sattvic state, and then the growing awareness of my spiritual being. And these were considered the 4 main steps towards what was called Sampragyata Samadhi. The Bhagavad Purana and many of the other texts, Vedic texts, they also present other ways of understanding it. And if we look at the commentators, the early commentators, the 4 principal commentators on the Yoga Sutra, they each shared different types of appreciation of what this actually means and how it can be understood and how it can be appreciated. Vyasa is not limiting how somebody should or should not appreciate. They are all valid. But in the Bhagavad Purana, there was a meditation upon the gross and subtle forms was looked at a little bit differently. And quite detailed information was given that that a person beginning this path should meditate in certain ways upon the material energy in its sum total and in its parts. This was called the Virat Rupa, the universal form, if I can put it that way. And what it did was help people to grow in the appreciation of themselves as being completely separate from the material energy. But then they would also encourage beyond that a meditation upon more subtle forms, and this was generally upon the transcendental form of Ishvara, which we will be speaking about in a few verses from here, so I won't go into that in any depth at the moment. But I will read one verse from the Bhagavad Purana that speaks about this. One who is interested in liberation, who accepts the path of liberation and is not attracted to the path of conditional life, is called a yati, or a renounced devotee. Such a person should first control his mind by thinking of the Virat Rupa, the gigantic universal form of the Lord, and then gradually think of the spiritual form of Bhagavan after hearing of both forms, and thus one's mind is fixed in samadhi. And so with this reference, you can see how the same principle could be explored, understood, and appreciated in not entirely different ways, but with some of them taking things a little bit further